Aloha. Hope you've had a good day. I have to confess I spent part of my morning at the beach. I've enjoyed my day so far. Okay, so you are here at the Division 53 Society of Clinical Child and Adolescent Psychology Presidential Address, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Atkins, who is the Director of the Institute for Juvenile Research at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where he has been on faculty since 1994 and where he has served as the Director of Psychology Training for over 10 years. Prior to that, Dr. Atkins was Director of the Pediatric Psychology Internship Program at Children's Seashore House and Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Dr. Atkins received his undergraduate degree from the University of California at Davis, a master's degree in human development from the University of Kansas, where, I might add, we missed overlapping in training by just 1 year, and his doctorate from Florida State University. Dr. Atkins is the recipient of many prestigious awards and most recently was named a University Scholar by the University of Illinois, Chicago. He's held multiple national offices, served on many NIH peer review committees and held appointments, including editor-in-chief for numerous journals, in addition to his current term as president for the Society of Clinical Child and Adolescent Psychology. While mentioning all of his accolades or commenting on his prolific writing would not allow us to hear Dr. Atkins speak today, I will highlight that he chaired the APA Task Force for Empirically Supported Treatments for Children in Poverty. Dr. Atkins has been a champion of the urban poor and has worked tirelessly to develop, in particular, school-based programs to assist these children. More recently, Dr. Atkins has turned his formidable clinical research skills to addressing the public health needs of our military members and their families. Dr. Atkins makes a cogent argument for the parallel needs of these two groups. With a passion driven in part from his lifelong commitment to equal justice and human rights, and in part from personal experience, he will no doubt make a very meaningful contribution to the lives of millions in this country and elsewhere, touched by the horrors of war and its aftermath. How fitting that we are in the South Pacific room, where major World War II conflict occurred, as we listen to Dr. Atkins. And now, please help me welcome Dr. Atkins as he presents the 2013 Presidential Address for the Society of Clinical Child and Adolescent Psychology, entitled The Soldiers Among Us: Suicide, Public Health, and Community.
Thanks very much. That was beautiful. So I am really pleased to be here and honored to be in this position and privileged to have followed Mary, who's been a wonderful friend and mentor in teaching me about being president and managing all those emails and those kinds of things. My talk today, is in keeping with the theme that Don Versoff established for this conference, and I knew I was going to do a talk on this, so I'm going to, my goal, and as we've had a couple of really wonderful symposia related to this topic from our division, and I thank Lori and Elise, Capella, and Mary for really arranging that. From anything I can tell, I think it is the first time our division has really focused on the needs of military families, and I hope it's a start of a conversation, not an end of a conversation. One of the goals of that was to really introduce to us, our field, clinical child psychology, some of the issues, needs, innovations going on in military families. I think we actually have a lot to learn, and I think we have an enormous amount to contribute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a very brief review of what some of those needs are, and they are quite compelling, as I'm sure most of us know. And I'm going to talk to you about the response going on at the federal level, the VA, Department of Defense, which is also considerable and actually quite historic. Then I'm going to talk about the gaps, which, to follow a theme, are themselves very considerable, and where I think we as a field can really make a contribution to filling some of those gaps. So first, what is the need? Well, as we know, and if you've attended any of the symposium workshops at the conference, we've had 2.3 million service members in the two recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq since 2001. These are the longest wars in U.S. history and the first with an all-volunteer armed forces. the largest deployment of National Guard and Reserve since World War II, and there are various estimates, but most people say somewhere between 40 and 50% of people on the front line are Guard and Reserve. We've never done that before. It's quite historic. And traumatic brain injury is known as the signature injury of this war due to the widespread use of improvised explosive devices. Ato Gawande, in the New England Journal of Medicine, as these wars were beginning and the fatalities were starting, made an interesting observation. He actually tracked, and if you excuse me, I just want to get some. I forgot. I have this. Okay. So he actually tracked the fatalities relative to injuries, and he showed, starting the Revolutionary War, that we're at an historic low, which is to say there are many fewer fatalities per injury. I updated that February 13th of this year based on a Congressional Budget Office report, which indicates that many more soldiers are coming home with injuries who in the past would have died. Traumatic brain injury, one of the recent estimates, 253,330. You can see the trend going up through 2011, and now as the war is winding down, it's reducing. Post-traumatic stress disorder, 131,341. Again, we see the trends going up at historic levels. And not surprisingly, there's considerable mental health concerns for the returning veterans. Recent estimates, 20% returning with PTSD or depression, 2/3 who served in the Army, 20% with TBI, 9% comorbid, 37% with alcohol dependence, and perhaps most concerning, 50% are not seeking treatment. Again, just to lay out the need, the recent deployments indicate that of a survey of some 2,000 soldiers returning 30 days post-deployment, 14% with PTSD, equal number with depression, and a little bit more with traumatic brain injury. 44% of soldiers returning from Iraq or Afghanistan reported depression or PTSD. And then in a study of 500 National Guard soldiers preparing to deploy, those with prior deployment had increased PTSD, depression, and somatic symptoms. And I show a graph on the right there. That's an independent study done by Klein and colleagues of 2,500 New Jersey National Guard, Army National Guard soldiers in 2008. And you can see the odds ratio of a prior deployment meant 3.5 times the rate of PTSD, 3 times the rate of depression, and twice the rate of chronic pain. And most alarming, and one that is attracting a lot of attention, is the suicide rates, which are the highest in history. As you can see here, there's a 2011 report. The suicide rate had been historically lower in the military service members relative to the population until 2006, and they've gone up 5 years in a row consecutively. Robert Gibbons and colleagues analyzed the recent data based on death records in 16 states and showed that the particularly vulnerable group were the 17 to 24-year-olds who had almost 4 times the odds of committing suicide if they were veterans. Risk for veteran suicide, PTSD, 4 times, 6 times if you're comorbid, TBI associated with 1.5 times the risk, and the Reserve and Guard are accounting for 42% of suicides, 3rd leading cause of death in the Guard. Again, we've never done this before with the Reserve and Guard, so this is historic, unprecedented, and we are not prepared. As go the soldiers, so go their families, so not surprisingly, what we see is the at-home parent is showing a considerable amount of distress. This is during deployment for depression, anxiety. This is a general severity indication of global severity of symptoms, and this is post-traumatic stress symptoms. And then recently returned, the rates are elevated, but not as high as during deployment. Another study of the mental health of Army wives, 35% with at least one mental health diagnosis, and you can see sleep, stress, neurotic symptoms, PTSD diagnosis. These are odds ratios, almost 1.5 times. Since we're clinical child psychology, I wanted to also point out, again, not surprisingly, as parents experience stress, we have 44% of deployed soldiers have children. You can see about a little over 1 million are active duty and 600,000 are in reserve. And this just breaks it down by age, showing that a little bit older in the Guard and Reserve. And then the deployment effects on kids. About a third of the children in military families were rated high for behavior problems. That's there. The odds of a child with behavior problems is 6 times greater if the parent is stressed, controlling for military support. That's there. And then in this study, this is just showing some of the complexity. The boys were responding to the parent returning home. This is a CBCL T-scores, and the girls were responding when the parent was away. These are mostly dads. So we know there's an historic and quite compelling set of problems for the veterans, for their families. So what's the response? Well, we're all aware of this enormous public health campaign, public media campaign. We see it all the time. Support our veterans. There's the president signing some legislation, probably the GI Bill, or some such. CVS Cares, we have bumper stickers, we have lawn signs, and so on. This has been going on a while, and I don't know that you can go very far anymore without seeing something about support our veterans. And this public media campaign is actually quite important, I think, and I think quite meaningful to veterans. In a study that Adrian Blow and colleagues did in Michigan recently, they added some questions to a State of the State survey that the Michigan State Public Health School had been administering to just get a sense of the views of the state. So they had about 1,000 stratified population, and about 29% reported knowing a member of the Michigan National Guard deployed since 2001. Keep in mind, that's 0.3% of the population. 29% of people know someone. Half of them are either family or close friends. So this is having quite an impact, even though it's a small number. 86% believe that tax dollars should support rehab. 75% supported a tax increase in Michigan, even during an intense recession. Now, whether or not they'd actually be supportive if that actually went through, we don't know. But this is a very strong indication, certainly in the state of Michigan, that this public media campaign is either reflecting the strong views of society, which I suspect it is, and or it's impacting, which it may be as well. So there are a couple of historic things going on at the Department of Defense and the Veterans Health Administration. Department of Defense spending $50 million in a collaboration with the NIH to study mental health risk and resilience among military personnel. $140 million to develop and implement resiliency training for all military personnel to promote mental toughness. This is this program here. And a 2010 task force on prevention of suicide, which is the first and most complete survey of factors impacting suicide in the military. These are historic, and there are some people who are suggesting in the literature, and I think perhaps quite accurately, that the military may be doing for mental health what they did for race relations back in the 40s and 50s. They may be confronting stigma and access in a way that our society in general is not. The VA is also mobilizing at historic levels. They've more than doubled the number of mental health providers between 2005 and 2009, and I'll show you that that's had some impact. Massive training on prolonged exposure therapy, the most successful treatment known for PTSD. 1,500 staff, 6 to 9 month weekly consultation. How's that for dissemination of evidence-based practices, right? Mandated involvement of families for all veterans treated for PTSD. These are the data on the national implementation. Just came out this past month. These are the intent to treat on this side. These are effect sizes of 0.8 to 0.9. Here for the completers, over 1. These are novice therapists who were trained to administer prolonged therapy, and they're showing pre to post changes here across the board. And interestingly, the subset of soldiers who were from these recent wars, which if you're not familiar with the vernacular is called OEF, OIF, or Operation Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom, they actually had the highest rates of success. 2,000 patients participated in this study. In Katz and colleagues, interestingly, with the VA doubling the number of mental health providers, it's had no impact on the national suicide rate of VA patients, which has been quite disappointing. Well, Katz and colleagues took a look at this, and they took a look at the distribution of mental health personnel across the VA centers in the United States. These are all the 21 VA centers in the United States. There were some regional centers. And what they found is the centers that had the most staffing, that were using the most mental health providers, actually showed a dramatic drop in suicide rates. Correlation of 0.53, if I remember right. That's a 28% variance. So that's substantial. Now this is a graph of that, breaking it down. The programs with the highest mental health staffing showed a decrease of 12.6% in suicide. The programs with the lowest staffing had an increase. So there's the national average for it. They estimated that a 28-37% increase equaled a 10% reduction in suicide. So as I say, this is historic, this is massive. We have nothing like this in the mental health field that I've seen, and this is being led by the VA hospitals. The VA is also doing its best to modernize. They banned Facebook in VA facilities up until 2010, until they realized that they were losing their young soldiers. So now they have a Facebook page, web-based programs, self-support groups, telehealth is very big in the VA. A colleague of mine, Peter Shore, got an award this morning from the VA division at APA for his work in telemental health. And some good news on family-centered interventions. This is Patricia Lester's work. She's been presenting at the conference. She was at the symposium yesterday morning. And this indicates this is a family-centered intervention that she and her colleagues have developed at UCLA. And this just basically shows NAD stands for not active duty, and AD is active duty. So this just shows nice changes in family functioning, reductions in anxiety and depression, nice effects for the kids as well. That's very, very promising, and these are VA-based studies. And lastly, the military, the multiple family group intervention that was developed originally for families of schizophrenics and has been used in a number of ways. This has also been modified for use with VA patients and families for nice effects. This one is called Reaching Out to Educate, Assist, Caring, and Healthy Families. There were two independent evaluations. This one is a small one with 11 veterans, but showing positive effects on all psychosocial functioning. These are psychoeducation mostly. These are not treatment, but they're showing nice effects in reducing burden on the family. So that's the good news. So where are the gaps? Well, the truth of the matter is the VA is overwhelmed. There are 850,000 veterans awaiting disability compensation. The average age of the VA is 48 for females, 63 for males, with 44% over 65. And as we saw with the CATS data, large variability of services dependent on where you are. This is a graph recently published in Psych Services that shows who these veterans are that are receiving this treatment for PTSD. And as you see, this large increase, which is the doubling of the mental health providers and so on since 2005, but the vast majority are Vietnam vets. These are the Persian War, and here are, I think I have a little arrow coming up, there we go, and these are the OEF veterans, the ones who are most at risk. So 85% of the services at the VA are for soldiers, veterans other than the ones from these recent wars. There's also a number of barriers, irrespective of the capacity. James Gordon had an interesting article in Atlantic Monthly. He's a psychiatrist at Georgetown. His quote was, "The focus on diagnosis and treatment may continue to alienate those it is supposed to serve and perpetuate the problem rather than offer a viable solution." 35% of National Guard soldiers surveyed 3 to 6 month post-deployment screened positive for mental health, but fewer than half received treatment. I mentioned that earlier. Barriers include stigma, concerns about impact on their record, reputation within the unit, spouse concerns and scheduling difficulties. Very often the veterans are not The families are not eligible for VA services, so they have to go outside, and sometimes those are not available. In addition, I mentioned the resiliency program, Comprehensive Soldier Fitness. If you're following this literature at all, there was a special issue in the American Psychologist on this in 2011. There's some controversy about it, but I just want to point out, and I don't want to make light of it, this is based on Marty Seligman's positive psychology work and some resiliency work he did with middle school kids in Philadelphia. But I want to just offer a quote here by George Casey. This is in the American Psychologist. Comprehensive Soldier Fitness is a strength-based resiliency program, so our soldiers can be better before deploying to combat, so they will not have to get better after they return. And I just suggest that there may be some implications of promoting resiliency as an inoculation for war trauma. In this recent study that was just done, just came out this year, close to 400 military personnel who had received this comprehensive soldier fitness training while in theater in Afghanistan, they did self-reports, and though, as the authors point out, there was a small effect of resilient thinking on morale, but both declined over time. And I think most concerning, 20 of the 30 recommended coping behaviors declined from pre and post, which just suggests that this may not be as powerful an intervention as they want, and I wonder what the implications are of being told that if you are resilient, you won't have these problems, and then you have these problems. I just wonder what the implications of that are. When studies that have looked at resilience and social support have found that post-deployment social support is equally related to traumatic stress and most predictive of growth. Even subsyndromal PTSD is associated with significant psychosocial difficulties. And here we see odds of predicting suicidal ideation, and you can see that social support, the lack thereof, has the greatest prediction of suicidal ideation. And this last point on social support, this was a study done out of Boston, 2,200 veterans, and this came out of the 1990-91 Gulf War. They followed them 18 to 24 months, and you can see pre to post PTSD and social support these are significant beta weights, but most importantly, perhaps, is this significant negative beta weight between PTSD and social support, indicating that PTSD is chasing people away. So social support has an enormously important role, and it's something that the soldiers may not be able to do on their own, despite whatever resiliency training they receive. And then there's the issue of reintegration, which is starting to get some attention. There was some wonderful presentations this morning at the symposium that our division sponsored, but it's not hit the literature. The 97 OEF veterans recently surveyed. 45% had difficulty moving on after deployment, 68% managing emotions, 74% problems with spouses, and so on. Interestingly, in a study of 114 veterans who were receiving treatment in a trauma recovery center, 79% were interested in having their families involved, 85% knew it was impacting their families, and 75% said they would enter services if only to help their child. Which indicates that this is something that's on their mind and actually something that can pull them into services. As we know in general in the literature, and it's played out here as well, children's psychosocial adjustment is largely mediated by parental social support. In an early study that Peter Jensen did from Gulf War, he showed that high rates of behavior problems were mediated by parental stress. Children's loneliness was related to mobility and lack of parental support. And then in this study, we see that the source of support, this is a positive, predicting kids' positive adjustment. Military support is most important, but non-military support, 2 times the odds ratios. If parents with parental support, kids have 2 times the chance of having a positive outcome. And in the study I mentioned that Adrian Blow and colleagues did in the survey in Michigan, they also asked another question, which is, who is responsible for these National Guard soldiers returning and reintegration? And not surprisingly, folks reported the federal government's responsible. They sent them over there. They're responsible for their return home, their physical, handling physical injuries and emotional injury. Lowe and colleagues were particularly concerned, though, that there was very little awareness of anything the community could do, which I'll suggest is an opportunity. So how do we fill the gap? Well, first of all, as the military is very aware, and as we've heard in the symposiums, that there's some various symposia going on at the conference, the public health model is about the only way to approach this. This is an epidemic. So there is a work going on at the universal level and the intensive level, but there's much less work at the targeted level, meaning the at-risk situations. I would suggest to you that these natural supports, issues of reintegration, and problems of daily living are things that we in the civilian community can do better than the military community. That they can't do this without us. And this is an opportunity for us to contribute. Robert Sampson's a noted sociologist, noted for his theory of collective efficacy in urban communities, but I thought this was a nice quote. Too often our policies and theories are looking to change only individuals. It's not that individuals are unimportant, but rather that much can be learned by focusing on events in their community context. And this from within the military. This is a retired colonel who's the former director of behavioral health in the U.S. Army Surgeon General. We need to talk more about getting soldiers through the times when they're lost and humiliated. We need to offer meaningful jobs for veterans and focus on reconnecting soldiers with their communities. When we think about quality of life, the kind of reintegration issues, we think about social material conditions, functioning, satisfaction. These are the kinds of things that happen at the community level, that happen in the real world. I offered this quote by a U.S. Army corporal. I wasn't scared to go to Iraq. I wasn't really even scared about what would happen when I lost my legs. If you want to know what I was really scared of, I was absolutely terrified to go home. So just drove home this reintegration issue. 1/4 to 1/2 of veterans who use VA services report difficulty in social functioning. 1/3 report divorce, dangerous driving, substance use. 96% expressed interest in receiving reintegration services. PTSD was associated with the most problems of reintegration and the most incentive for getting services. So there's a tremendous need there, and something that a gap that I think we need to be thinking about. The National Guard and Reserve is especially vulnerable to reintegration issues. Again, reiterating, we've never done this before. We've never used the National Guard and Reserve as a frontline fighting force. We've never multiple deployed them, and we've never brought them home and told them within 3 weeks of coming home to go back to work and go to school. We've never done this before. When soldiers come home, they come home to a base, National Guard and Reserve, you know. So the unique stressors, they talk about the Guard and Reserve becoming suddenly military. I will also point out that they become suddenly civilian. Majority return to work within 90 days. Military support is often lacking. They're dispersed throughout the community, and the community support service often lack knowledge. I just want to note some very interesting work as I was preparing for this talk and reading this literature that I wasn't as familiar with. Huebner and colleagues, Jay Mancini and at Virginia Tech University, are doing some really interesting work on trying to engage community on behalf of veterans. She makes this point, or they make this point, primary function of formal networks, and I would suggest that's us, formal networks, should be the support of informal networks, because it is there that are most accessible to individuals and families and those that most often rely on a daily basis. And this, of course, we're used to. This is the nested model of Bronfman that Bronfman Brenner introduced to us, with individuals nested within community and so on. So what would be ecological targets? Well, of course, we have home, parenting, self-care. We have work and school, various issues going on there. And then we have play, friendships, skills, anger management. All are important. All are going on in our communities around us. And let me just close with a couple of examples of how I think we might be able to do this. The first one that I think is close to us in clinical child, and certainly close to my work, is military children in civilian schools. In a study done, this was the Marine Corps, they have liaisons in all their bases, 21 bases across the United States, that are there to serve families and liaison with schools. So they did a study to see what were these liaisons dealing with, what were the issues that they were dealing with. It turns out that most children nationally, this isn't just Marine Corps, most children nationally, even within the Army, the active duty, are in civilian schools. 70% the estimate is. And of course the Guard and Reserve are entirely in civilian schools. And very often, as a RAND report indicated, the civilian schools may not even know that there's a military family in their school, even if they're close to a base when the RAND surveyed them. But I want to just note something here. These are some of the problems that the families were reporting. School policies, they were having difficulty with that. School transitions were tough. Kids were having discipline problems. But look at this one. 40% of the families reported that the kids did not have access to extracurricular activities, and 40% said that they were socially isolated. When this is Saltzman and colleagues at UCLA have a nice model looking at the course of issues that come up before deployment, during deployment, after deployment, and the various things that are going on. The point being that when a soldier is deployed, most people understand it's stressful. What they don't get is there's stress before deployment, during deployment, and after deployment. And these things just continue, especially if there's mental health difficulty. So children often miss activities due to personal or family stress. Parents may avoid involvement in school because of embarrassment of some of the problems going on at home. Some of this was out of a RAND report. Frequent absences, homework not done. And in this RAND report on deployment and the effect of deployment on achievement, they did some focus group with kids. And the kids said they really don't want the pity of people. They don't want people to know they're military and then have them feel sorry. That's not what they're looking for. And they also don't want professional support. Not all, but many don't. So providing counselors or groups for military kids is not an answer for these kids. That's not what they're looking for. They're looking to get along. They're looking to get engaged. They're looking to be involved. And I'll offer a couple of examples of what that might look like based on some prior literature. There's my colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, John Fantuzza, has done some work on parent buddies, where parents link to other parents to support them through a system. We've done that work in Illinois as well. It's also called peer navigators, which is hitting the health field. People who can actually help other people get through a system better than we as professionals can because they're closer to them and they understand their needs. So this is something that we can get going on behalf of families. Peer buddies in a similar kind of way. We've been doing some of this work where older kids link to younger kids. Fantuzza's done this work as well. And this could be a way to kind of integrate kids into natural social support. So John Fantuzza has shown that kids who are socially withdrawn, when they're linked to a popular peer, he gives them an hour to play together and then he just watches them play in the natural environment. They get more linked in with the other kids just by virtue of knowing this popular peer. And after-school programs are very important for these kids. It's important that they are given the support that they need, the programs, that is, to accommodate for the needs of these kids. It may be because of some of the stressors that they're going to have special needs. These activities are far too important for the kids to miss. This is similar to the work we're doing in the Chicago area, and I know my colleague Stacy Frazier, who's doing some work with the Chicago Park District in that regard, where we're providing them the kind of support they need to keep the kids that we work with in these after-school programs. And then the second example, again, I think somewhat close to those of us on university campuses, are the student veterans. It's an estimate of about 700,000 student veterans since 2009, when the new GI Bill law passed, and estimate of about 500,000 in schools nationwide this year. In a survey that was done in collaboration with the Student Veterans of America, a survey of about 600 student veterans, 58% reported they had combat experience, 45% heavy combat. And note these problems. Almost 45% reported suicidal ideation, 20% of the plan, 35% social anxiety, high rates of PTSD, and over 20% with severe depression. Our universities are trying to respond in many ways. This is an artist rendition of what will be called Legacy Hall at Florida State University. It's a beautiful building. And there's some real value in this. This gives the military units on campus and the veterans on campus a strong presence and a place for them to congregate. It can be a safe and supportive transition. You can accommodate their unique needs. But will it limit their social networks? Will it help them integrate into the real world? I wonder what would happen if we had buildings for Latino students, African American students, Jewish students, Catholic students. We know there's diversity within these groups. There's lots of diversity within veterans. So I would suggest that this is not a bad thing. I would suggest, though, that it's a limited approach and that we need to do much more to integrate the students into the ongoing world of campus life. This was a qualitative study that was done with 25 student veterans. They interviewed them on what it was like to move into the military, move through the military, move out of the military. But they also talked with them about what's it like moving into campus here. What's it like being on campus? And notice some of the things. Obviously, the mental health issues are there. But notice some of these other things. Connecting with peers. A RAND report also reported this. They didn't know how to talk to kids that just came out of high school, where these folks had been, off in Iraq and Afghanistan. They didn't know how to blend in. They didn't know how to interact with faculty. A recent article I was reading was talking about many faculty don't know how to talk to a student whose last job involved carrying a loaded weapon. And I think that's fair. On campus, there isn't a real sense of what it's like to be in the military. And they talked about, the colleagues talked about this need for a transition coach, which is a great idea. And I would suggest that it's an even better idea if it becomes naturalistic. If it's not a formal advisor that people don't want to go to, but a fellow peer. And not just, and I heard this morning about a terrific program out of the University of Michigan using senior veterans to support junior, new veterans on campus. But I'll suggest that that's not enough. Who's working with the faculty? Who's working with the graduate advisors? How are we integrating these veterans into our campus? It's happening right now in real time on our college campuses. At the University of Chicago, we have almost 1,000 GI Bill students. All right, so let me close up then. So I want to just want to highlight that there's some implications. This is very relevant to the work we're doing in InterCity, and these principles I'm going to suggest to you are the same ones or similar ones that we're using with our work. First thing I want to suggest that I think is very positive for our approach in mental health is that what a problem like this does, such as inner-city poverty or veterans' mental health issues, is it helps us think about what matters most. It helps us realign mental health resources to affect the key predictors that promote successful adaptation. It's not about counseling, it's really about functioning. And then we can think about how to integrate our programs or our services into the natural social supports by, as Eubner and colleagues point out, activating informal networks and bridging multiple ecologies. There's a natural extension from prevention to intervention by promoting healthy adaptation in natural settings. And lastly, as we see, there's a huge capacity issue, so this is a way to expand our sense of the mental health workforce. Who can be providing mental health support? It isn't only the mental health professionals, it's also the people that matter most. And in the work that we do in Chicago as teachers, I'd say that would be true for the military families as well, peers, and so on. So, to summarize, the escalating suicide rates and corresponding mental health needs of veterans and their families represent an urgent public health concern. The VA and Department of Defense are mobilizing at rapid and historic pace. The limitations and gaps in services indicate that they cannot solve this alone. Ecological models redefine mental health as residing in the settings, people, and tasks that matter most to veterans and their families. Thank you. So I don't know if anybody has any questions, comments, anything anybody wants to ask about or dialogue about. Thank you very much.